What's up everyone, it's King Moose here with JCross X to welcome you all back for episode 43 of Class Overview. For those who aren't familiar, the Class Overview series is a collection of informative videos where we'll be discussing the different classes in Fire Emblem 3 houses. We'll be going over general information about each class, like their certification requirements, stats, abilities, and their overall strengths and limitations to determine their viability and what units are a good fit for each class. As per usual, these videos be gameplay focused, so there shouldn't really be any major spoilers, but I advise you anyways to watch your own discretion, and if you haven't played 3 houses yet, you absolutely should. This episode will be focused on the Great Knight class. While dismounted, it's a very basic 4-move infantry class, but while mounted, it jumps up to 7-move. It follows the cavalry movement archetype, which means it takes an increased movement penalty on all types of tiles besides regular tiles, particularly on stairs. Great Knight comes with 3 class abilities. It gets both Lance Fair and Axe Fair, which increase the damage you deal with lances and axes respectively by 5. As a start ability, it gets Canto, as you can expect from a mounted class, which grants the extremely useful ability to use your leftover movement after performing an action. In order to certify for Great Knight, you'll need at least a B+ rank in both axes and riding, as well as an A rank in heavy armor. There's room to gamble the certification with a bit lower ranks, but clearly this is a difficult certification even if just counting the sheer number of skill ranks required for it, let alone any other context. As for skill rank bonuses, Great Knight grants a +3 skill XP boost to axes, lances, and heavy armor. The axe and lance boosts are both very nice. They can help you pick up higher weapon prowess levels, axe or lance crit +10, and maybe even some combat arts if you haven't unlocked them all yet. As for the heavy armor boost, this one isn't very useful. The best thing it can be used for is to pick up weight -5 at the A+ rank, but I really don't think the skill synergizes well enough with Great Knight to be worth the investment. These skill bonuses obviously don't help much in terms of promotion options, as Great Knight is intended to be an endgame class. The only thing I can think of is that the lance boost is nice to help units who went down the armored class promotion path to Great Knight to also pick up the paladin certification, but that's a very niche benefit.
The base stats of Great Knight are somewhat respectable, but nothing too crazy. It's got the highest HP and defense stats of the master classes, sitting at a solid 34 and 17 respectively. The issue here is that if you're promoting from Fortress Knight, these classes share the same 17 base defense, while Fortress Knight actually has one higher base HP point at 35. A lot of units who transition to this class do come from Fortress Knight, or at least certify into the class before promoting, whether it be to acquire said bases, or train axes and heavy armor more. The rest of the stats are average to below average at best, sitting at the normal 10 magic, 14 dex, 12 luck, whilst having 10 res and 10 speed, making it easily the slowest of the Master Stage classes. As for growth rates, they are probably not what you'd expect for this point in the game. It has a plus 30% growth modifier to HP and a plus 10% growth to strength, which match Fortress Knights. However, its defense growth is at a measly 5%, which is much more of a standard for regular physical classes, not ones tailored towards prot tanking. In addition, it shares the same minus 10% growth penalty that pretty much all armored classes have to speed, whilst having a minus 5% to res that while Armor Knight has, Fortress Knight does not. All it gets for having 10% worse defense growth and a res penalty on top of that is immediately plus 5% growth to charm, which frankly will not do much for your unit in this class. While some of you have commented that growth rates don't really matter that much in Master classes, we still personally think that the last 15 unit levels of gameplay can still provide decent stat increases before some of the final maps, so we still value them to a decent degree. Regardless of your stance, the growth rates being this subpar just doesn't really make any sense. The boosts are actually pretty solid though, with a very respectable plus 5 to HP and a plus 8 to defense while mounted and plus 6 when dismounted. This is lower than the plus 10 to Fortress Knight, but that obvious trade-off is the fact that the class actually has decent move as well as granting an appreciated plus 1 of strength that Fortress Knight does not have. Additionally, the class only has a minus 4 to speed when mounted and minus 2 when dismounted instead of minus 6, but you are more than likely going to be doubled in either of these classes anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much.
Mastering Great Knight grants the equipable ability to Defiant Defense. We've gone over a good few of these Defiant abilities at this point, so I'm sure most of you already have a good understanding of what this one does. It activates when your unit enters combat with their current HP at 25% of their max HP or lower. To clarify, this means it won't activate mid-combat, but it can activate mid-phase. Once it's activated, it grants a plus 8 buff to defense during both player phase and enemy phase that persists until your unit's HP leaves that 25% range, which deactivates it. Plus 8 defense is a very significant buff to survivability, especially since you are very likely to be doubled in this class, but overall, I honestly think this is the worst of the Defiant abilities we discussed so far. To start with the positives, this is helpful for prot tanking, which is Great Knight's niche, so there's some synergy between the class itself and its mastery. On units with already high defense and a shield equipped, you will likely be invulnerable to all physical attacks once you reach the HP threshold. This is niche, but it can also increase the damage of the combat art Armored Strike, which scales off defense, though it's only around a 2 to 3 point increase, so it's not very significant. Moving on to the negatives, this has a similar problem as Defiant Avoid, where it can be difficult to activate, even more so than most of the other Defiant skills, since everything else in your prot tank build will make it hard to take enough damage to get down to low HP in the first place. Mages will bypass most of it, but there's a good chance they will just one-round you if you allow them to hit you. I will say this isn't too big of a deal, since there are ways to inflict self-damage like the Devil Weapons and the Hero's Relics on units who don't have a crest, but it's still annoying. Unlike Falcon Knight, Great Knight can use Guard Adjutants, which can also be helpful for this. The other issue with Defiant Defense is how late it's unlocked, since you have to not only reach level 30, but also earn a very large amount of class XP to pick up as mastery. This means it's difficult to build around since you just won't have it for a lot of important chapters. This applies to all the master class masteries, but for Great Knight it feels particularly awkward. If the plus 8 defense is really a big difference maker for your Prot tank capabilities, I have to wonder what you're doing in Great Knight in the first place, since that implies your Prot tank has been struggling to keep up for most of the game. Overall, Defiant Defense isn't a useless ability if you build around it correctly, but it's definitely very situational and isn't a big selling point for this class.
Great Knight is not the best class, but it does have some pretty unique strengths to talk about. I know it's kind of repetitive, but movement in particular is actually much more of a strength here than it is for some other classes. The rest of the armored classes in this game have pretty abysmal movement, so this one stands out for actually having really nice move at 7. This means it doesn't have to be constantly babysat with a bunch of utility that might be wasted on a less mobile Prot tank. On top of that, even though the boost isn't as high as Fortress Knight's, plus 8 to defense is still a lot, which helps it maintain its bulk while still having the aforementioned positional flexibility. This can work nicely with abilities such as Battalion Wrath, which allow you to keep your HP high for Prot tanking and still have the potential to do very high damage. Even if you don't use it as an enemy phaser, you can cherry pick weaker targets in the player phase with lower might weapons that do very little if any damage to your tanky unit. Grey Knight also having both Lancefair and Axefair is a strength in our opinion, as it makes the class more accessible and viable on a larger pool of units, rather than if it just had one, since both Lances and Axes can function fine in this class. Having Lances as a secondary weapon option can be utilized more often than you think, since Axes as well as units in this class in general tend to have accuracy issues. Lastly, being grounded comes with a typical grounded strength such as better battalion options. This is especially important on Great Knight since boosting protection and accuracy as much as possible is pretty important, while boosting damage and crew rate is obviously good too. The Goneril Valkyries in particular is an excellent battalion that provides more of an all-rounder spread for this class that boosts pretty much everything it needs. The Dusker Heavy Soldiers on the other hand provide less to hit and no crit boost, but a massive plus 8 to physical damage and plus 10 to protection at max level, which can help survivability immensely. Additionally, Healer and more importantly Guard Adjutants can be used in this class, which are both pretty useful for Great Knight specifically.
There are an unfortunate set of weaknesses to discuss when it comes to Great Knight. The first and arguably the most infamous one is the certification. Like I said before, just by sheer number of skill ranks alone, requiring 2 B+ ranks and an A rank is a very hefty requirement. This is even worse for lance wielding Great Knights as they will have to train their lance rank in addition to these 3 requirements. If you're using this class as a side grade from Paladin, the certification is very awkward since the axe requirement, especially the heavy armor requirement, both kind of come out of nowhere. As a promotion from Fortress Knight though, it is a lot more manageable. The riding requirement is still very random and unprecedented, but it's pretty much the only thing we'll need to train since the axe and heavy armor requirements are only slightly higher than Fortress Knight. The certification is definitely a weakness of the class, but I do think it's somewhat over-exaggerated. If you plan in advance to end up in Great Knight, it won't be too much of an issue getting there. Moving on, while Great Knight's defense is excellent, its speed and res are both subpar, leaving it very vulnerable to enemy mages. You would expect this from an armored class, but another issue I have is that I feel like this class, and the other armored classes for that matter, just aren't strong enough. It's a decent class for strength, but given how much slower it is than Wyvern Lord, I feel like it should hit a lot harder than it does, especially since the axe-wielding Great Knights often have accuracy issues. Paired with the fact that this class doesn't grant an exclusive combat art or anything else unique, the damage output of this class is inconsistent, depending heavily on the unit's own capabilities rather than anything the class provides. Great Knight also does have lower movement than Paladin and Bone Knight, and this is unfortunate but expected given how tanky this class is. However, this leads into one of my personal grievances with this class, the skill level bonuses. It should definitely have a riding bonus. I honestly think they should have given it 4 bonuses, which isn't completely unprecedented since Enlightened 1 has 4. But if they're set on sticking to only 3, then the heavy armor boost should have been skipped in favor of riding. A riding boost would have been really nice to pick up movement plus 1 at the A+ rank more easily, which is an excellent skill for a frontline class like this. Meanwhile, the heavy armor boost is nearly useless. Weight minus 5 is not going to make a difference on a class as low as this one, and Armored Effect Null is just not worth the insane amount of skill XP it requires.
Overall, we decided on a 3 out of 10 for this class, mirroring Fortress Knight's ranking. Combat-wise, actually is pretty good performance but is held back by a decent amount of aspects. The certification, while often exaggerated, is still one of the worst to have to deal with and is pretty awkward to transition to given its pre-promotion options. Despite the better move, it's less tanky than Fortress Knight whilst also being pretty much just as slow. The strength of this class is also not the highest, which feels strange given that the class does have the previously mentioned accuracy issues. Tankier units often have these issues, and whilst they have high strength, Great Knight's plus 1 to strength feels somewhat low when something like Wyvern Master has a plus 4 to strength and speed, which just makes it feel like that class hits way harder. Speaking of those tankier units, who makes a good Great Knight? By far our best recommendation is Gilbert, and this is probably the last and only time we will mention him. He has a boon and high bases in literally all the skill ranks you need for this class, whilst having access to Bat Wrath and a good statistical distribution for prot tanking. He's also exclusive to the most cavalry-friendly route, and as such he can definitely make a very solid Great Knight. Speaking of units exclusive to Azurmoon, Dedu is another good recommendation for similar reasons. He has boons and axes, heavy armor and lances, so if you can push past the Riding Bane, the rest of the important skills should come easy. On top of that, he has another unit that has good defensive stats and Bat Wrath. He's a bit better than Gilbert in the player phase though, with Lancefair Booster's Vengeance being a very solid option for him to be an effective dual phaser. Next up, we have Sylvain and Ferdinand. Both can use this class as a bulky alternative to Paladin for a player phasing Swift Strikes user, but they can have a few differences in regard to who's better. Sylvain has a boon in Lances, Axes, and Riding, but not one in Heavy Armor unfortunately. However, he is actually decently bulky, not too far off of Gilbert's bulk, whilst also originating from the house that has the most friendly route for Cavalry. For Ferdinand, the Black Eagle's routes are worse for Cavalry and he is one of the harder units to recruit out of house. He also isn't as bulky as Sylvain, but his saving grace is that he at least has a budding talent in Heavy Armor which can make the certification a lot easier. Sylvain is probably the better choice, but using Ferdinand often leads to a faster acquisition of desired skill ranks. Hilda and Alois are also decently defensive and have Bat Wrath with a few boons and budding talents in the desired skill ranks, making their certification not too bad either since neither of them have Banes and Ares that you'd want to raise. Lastly, we have Raphael. He's basically just worse than Dedue and Great Knight whilst having the same Riding Bane issue. He has no benefit to using Lances, but he at least shares a lot of the similarities to Dedue, being a Bat Wrath user with good bulk and boons and axes and heavy armor. Generally speaking, if you have a Prot tank, I'd most likely recommend putting them in this class solely based on the fact that its movement is better. However, this is assuming you are willing to push past the somewhat difficult certification requirements that often deters anyone who isn't specialized for this class to stay far away from it.
Since it received the same rating as Fortress Knight, we're going to put Great Knight right next to Fortress Knight in D tier. We do personally think that Great Knight is a better class than Fortress Knight despite the slightly lower defense. The massive increase in movement more than makes up for that, and it fixes one of the main design issues with armor classes, which is their inability to keep themselves on the front line due to having low movement. However, while we do think its overall performance is improved enough to be worth the trade-off, it is a significantly more demanding class to certify into, and the stats just simply don't provide nearly as much of a power spike as Fortress Knight does when it's first unlocked at level 20. For those reasons, relative to the stage of the game when it's unlocked, it falls down here. And the poll on JCross' channel for the best Master Cavalry class, Great Knight is currently in last place with only 8% of the vote. Given the weaknesses we discussed, this isn't surprising at all. We don't personally think that it's the worst of the four, but it's definitely not the best, and we can see the argument for it being the worst. Still, it can be a fun class to use and is arguably the best of its particular niche, that being prot tanking, so you can certainly find success with it if you know how to build around its strengths and choose the right unit for the job. That's basically all I have to say about the Great Knight class. If you liked the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment. I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels. Stay tuned for episode 44 on JCross' channel, where we will be moving on to the next master class, Bow Knight.